Hi, Mama Film Village. I'm Leela Meadow Connor, a mother founder of this Mama Film series. Thank you for joining us for this week's Community Cinema Convo, a video podcast where film fans can join the conversation and support the work of stories and storytellers that we love. Mama Film is a film series to showcase films with themes of nurturing and to ignite conversation around the human experience. Since we're not physically able to gather in our micro cinema here in Wichita to experience movies and other mediums of storytelling, we're excited to have this platform to connect us, at least in some way, with people, in this case, from all over the country, which is wonderful. I'd like to introduce our co-host, Eric Moore, joining us from Los Angeles, where he works as a programmer for AFI film festivals, AFI Docs, and AFI Fest. And today we're talking about the hilarious and wonderful web series, Old Guy. And we're so lucky to have the storytellers, two of the storytellers, Jen Burton and Gabrielle Burton. But before we get started, we feel it would be remiss if we didn't recognize our current state of affairs. Specifically, we want to say that Mama Film stands with our Black community, our Black creators, our Black audience members, Black parents, nurturers, and carers everywhere. Our hearts are with the families of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many more of the countless victims of unjust racism and violence in America and beyond. And I think it's important that we recognize that. And, you know, of course, we're still leading our lives, but Black Lives Matter now, Black Lives Matter always. So I wanted to just, before we get started talking about Old Guy, Jen and Gabrielle, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share on that specific topic, feel free to do so.
Well, it's such a time. And one thing that is so clear, it was something we were thinking about with Old Guy, was people said, gosh, you know, ageism was sort of suddenly there. And I feel it's the same way. And we said, no, it's just that COVID sort of uncovered something that's been there. And suddenly people are recognizing it and seeing it. And I feel like that's this moment too, is that, you know, systemic racism has been, you know, here forever. And now people are seeing it in a way that is just so devastatingly horrible, but it's always been there. So I think that it's such a important thing first, before we can act, to actually see the problem. And at last, I think that, you know, it's just impossible not to see it.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think that was really well said, Jen. I would add that I think that we sisters have been talking about this too. It's so hard not to feel sort of demoralized and overwhelmed and angry about all of this stuff all the time. And I feel like you know, yesterday was in tears because of something that happened in our hometown. And it just is, you just sort of despair. And one of the things that we sisters as a company obviously have moved, you know, more and more in the direction is in the face of despair, what can you do? Because hope is the most powerful tool for political change. And so you have to look to how you can act, rather than seeing all of these horrible things happening and just withdraw or stay in that despair, to then say, okay, what is my responsibility and how can we move forward, and how can I contribute to making to this problem find a solution, or to making things around me better, in small ways and in very big ways. And so that's what, you know, each of us has that responsibility in the face of these really difficult.
Right. I wrote my dissertation on hope in the arts, and sort of the arts as a political tool. And you know, cynicism is complicity, and sort of feeling, you know, when you don't, we have to first, as I said, sort of name and recognize the truth and everything that's happening. And then we need to figure out what we each can do, because we all have to make a different world. You know, we each have to contribute. So if we do despair, that's maintaining the status quo. And that's just, you know, we have to figure out what we each can do.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And just, you know, we stand for equality and equity, and we strive to share projects with our audiences that shine a light where issues need to be seen. So While we don't want to take any attention away from the protests or the movement, we are fortunate to have an opportunity to discuss another type of discrimination faced by many people in our society, and that's ageism. So Leela and I will moderate the first part of the conversation and begin with some questions. And then if anybody else has any questions that they want to add, feel free to type them in the chat. So Bill, Cheryl, anyone else, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that's me. So Jen and I have talked a little bit about your amazing parents. And for those of you who didn't know, that was them in Old Guy, your mom and your dad. And Jen and Gabrielle, it's such a wonderful and fascinating story about your parents and how they got into showbiz and how they, came to LA, and there's a wonderful AFI connection. I'm wondering if you can maybe share a little of the backstory there.
Sure. So Mom was a writer. She wrote a memoir about the feminist movement and about, she ran to be a delegate for Shirley Chisholm and sort of about that experience in the 70s. And then she went into writing fiction and was writing novels, and then had Heartbreak Hotel published, and was working on another project that became a screenplay. And she realized, like, why am I teaching myself screenwriting when there's these incredible schools, So she decided to apply to AFI, and she became the oldest student there in her late 50s, and thought she would just go for a year. It was expensive. My dad was on sabbatical, so they sort of went for a lark. And then she won the screenwriting award. So she got a second year. So they worked out this whole thing. My dad was actually 11 years older than she was. So they had really this incredible shift in their life where they decided to do the second year. They commuted, and then they decided to move to LA and start a completely different experience. My dad retired from being a professor, and then he was at a party and somebody said, "I love your face. Will you be in my movie?" Which is like the joke of the Hollywood
LA story.
Yeah, LA story, right? But he's 70 something, right? And it turned out it was a Disney director who was doing a film, and he did it, and then ended up getting an agent and worked all the time. He was on Shameless and Jay Leno show and George Lopez, and just like over the whole last 2 decades of his life, he had all of these wonderful adventures playing these parts. And so one thing that was striking was, as he was, because he was doing it for his own fun, many actors need to take any part that they get because it's a really difficult profession, but he wasn't in that situation. So he was able to sort of read scripts or read auditions and decide if he wanted to do them or not. And one thing that we found with so many of the parts was that they were these very narrow, stereotyped ideas of what it is to be older. So, and very often they just were named Old Guy. That was the name of the character. And they'd come in as a kind of a comic note, a comic little thing for the developed younger characters. So my dad and Mom were talking about this all the time, because they said, here we are, we're these, we're in our, by this point, 60s and 70s, moved to LA, start a whole new career, living on Venice Beach, have grandkids, have, all of this, she's writing, he's acting, and they don't see that kind of experience reflected in characters on television. They see just this kind of very small idea. Often it's, also, it would be like a joke. So it would be, somebody in Depends, or somebody who is senile.
Often the context of a joke in terms of young people's experience.
Right, exactly. So it would be the dirty old man, and the person would say, "How could he, be lusting after my wife?" or something like that, right? And but it was not about the actual character. A lot of times it was just sort of the punchline. So we were thinking, again, as artists, like, what can you do when you sort of see this thing? We started reading about it, and it turns out that this can have this really detrimental effect on people's sense of what's possible in life. That really having a narrow idea of old age, and there's actually direct research about television itself, that people who watch these images on television are affected by what they think is possible in their own lives. So we thought, well, what can we do about this? And we decided to make a comedy so that it would be funny and fun, and yet also be able to kind of have people start thinking about this and being able to understand their own media in a different way.
So, okay, that's the story of your parents. Let's talk a little bit about the production company that you guys founded. So Five Sisters Productions is the name of your company. How did you and your five sisters come up with this idea to have a production company together? Were you always kind of involved in the arts? Like, how did that kind of come about?
Should I take it, Jen?
Yeah, take care, bro.
We're very close in age. We're 8 years apart, and our parents raised us, if I want to go back to the beginning, where we would go on these trips together, and our dad was a professor. He'd been a jazz musician initially, and then he went into research on developmental psych and became a professor in that field. And so he was a professor, our mother was a writer. They would stretch a dollar incredibly, but they still also wanted a lot of adventure, especially our mother in the 70s. It was a time when people were pretty conservative regarding gender roles, et cetera. It was changing, but for a woman with 5 children, she could not get on the back of a motorcycle and go across country to do research on her book, which is what she wanted to do. And so what happened was she put us all in the red station wagon, and we all went across country to do the research for her book. And that meant that we had to get a box of cereal to share because we were 7 people, and we had a certain budget every day. And our parents would then also give the little spiral notebook accounts. And each day, I was 7, I had to keep the accounts of how much did they spend on a cup of coffee and how much did we spend on the box of Cheerios. And that was excellent preparation for becoming filmmakers. And
you were producing back then.
Yeah. And our parents also were very generous regarding Old Guy as well, and sharing in their experience. So they shared with us all of these things along the way of what it was to have a household run, of the struggles that they faced as artists, as the struggles they faced in their careers, or the successes as well, and enjoying those successes as you go along and seeking the good and making things work with whatever you had. And so we then all ended up becoming artists in different capacities, actually, and gravitated toward the film arts, and then came together. Initially, it was 2 sisters who came together in doing theater, which then developed into film. We all then came together on another project. And in that, there was kind of this synthesis of, we can pool all of our talents to make something greater than the individual. And as we've continued together, we started in features, and then we've moved into this space of kind of returning to the roots of social engagement and through art. And so that's how this whole thing is developed.
Yeah, and as Gabrielle said, like she went to film school in France. I thought I wanted to do an experimental theater company, and I mean, we all had like different things that we were developing. So it was really neat to kind of come together on these early films. And now the way it works is that we have a kind of umbrella company. So somebody will have an idea that they want to do, and they'll come to the group, and we'll all sort of think through what would be the way that we could contribute the most to making something happen.
That's great. It's really awesome to have that kind of support, and it's not always easy to work with your family, so kudos to that. I love my sisters, but if I was working full-time with them, I don't know if we would survive.
That's so funny, Eric, because there seems to be sort of 2 camps. The people who say, I can't cross the street with my sister, and the people who say, oh my gosh, I wish I could work with my sister. Or the people who are like, yes, I work with my family, and yes, we totally understand all of the things that we deal with as a family company of, trying to create boundaries of don't talk about work on, a holiday or that kind of thing. But you figure it out if and the great thing about it is in filmmaking, you create a family anyway. Yeah. And so our family just expands and contracts based on what stage of production we're in. And as time has gone on, we work with a lot of the same people again and again who we really love. And so it is sort of this bigger family. And it's a nice thing that then you have this core group within the family that also, you know, are there, and they're not going to be, you know, leaving the project in a year because we're all stuck with each other.
Well, I mean, I guess, so talk a little bit about, you know, what it's like to have a production meeting with your sisters, and where do you draw the boundaries? Like, how do you do that?
We actually have very clear boundaries. So we start out with, and I think a lot of people have had this at this time with the COVID, with the Zoom, that they'll sort of start out with like 10 minutes of catch up because everybody feels they need something. But you know, the whole time could be that if you know, so we always have had that. So actually we've been able to segue into this Zoom time. But having, you know, sort of 10 minutes for personal or catch up, and then the agenda of the meeting to be able to talk about what have people done, and what are things that people need other people to do. That's, I think, really tricky because we like to work together. So we like to all do things. We would like to sort of all do a lot of it together, but to be very efficient, you have to kind of divide and conquer a little bit more. So that I think is a challenge. And also what Gabrielle said about holidays and not talking about work all the time, you know, that we've said, like, when you have a social phone call, let's just have it be a social phone call if we can do that. Because otherwise, anybody who has a family business knows it just can be everything all the time, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. A family business. That makes sense. It's just a different type of business. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I also think is fascinating about the series itself is that it was from 2013, right? 2013.
We shot it then. We finished it.
That's when you shot it, right? So, but it all seems so current and even more now somehow. So,
isn't that amazing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's both incredible and sad in a lot of ways.
I know.
But
It's
glad
funny,
that it's tackled. You know?
Yeah, one of our friends actually on one of the Zoom calls, who's worked with us on a number of projects, says that there is something he said it's so interesting because in some ways we sisters are thinking about a lot of these issues before maybe the mainstream culture starts thinking about them. And so with Kings, Queens, and In-Betweens, that film took 6 years to make, but even when it came out, RuPaul was just becoming a household name. Before that, you know, the idea of, and yet in the film, it talks about bathroom use, it talks about all sorts of identities, and it talks about things that people are kind of coming into more mainstream consciousness in the last few years. And he said, so now this you were thinking about, and you know, wrote the script and you shot it, and then you come to finish it, and now it's suddenly exploding onto the mainstream. And he said, so your other project about the Donner Party, I'm a little concerned as to
Right, exactly. Suddenly cannibalism is in the zeitgeist.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like, I don't know that I want you to keep pursuing that project.
Yeah. Careful.
Yeah. So one thing that happened, I think, is that, you know, we all have our other projects. So we did do this other feature, you know, after shooting this, and we had, my mom actually got pancreatic cancer. So that was the first sort of thing that went on hold from that. And we knew that we knew how big an impact it could have. And so we didn't want to just kind of, you know, throw it out there as a thing. We wanted to really give it a chance to find its audience, and, you know, and so there was sort of this weird combination of these work things that, you know, I'm a professor and I'm making a short series on women in American history as part of that. And so we had these other projects that we were finishing, and every sort of year or so we'd say, should we do Old Guy? You know, it's now the time for Old Guy. And it was, you know, when COVID happened, it was like, now is the time, this is it. And it was just so interesting that sort of all of the pieces, as you said, suddenly I have a Google alert for ageism, and normally you get nothing, or you get one, right? And suddenly you're getting like 12, 14, 15, you know, every day. You can't even keep up with how people are suddenly recognizing something that is hopefully we're all going to get old, right?
Right.
So suddenly to have people kind of recognize that this is not this little side thing, right? That it can have these profound effects on policy and on behavior and all sorts of things, just because people haven't really thought through what do we feel about older age, you know?
And it's interesting, even in the making, when we decided to do it, that was right in the beginning of COVID, because we saw, as from kind of January into March, this rise of ageist narrative. But it wasn't actually in the sort of, people weren't talking about it as, hey, there's this rise in ageist narrative. And so we thought, you know what, this is the moment to have something come out. Because the other thing about the series is they're all very short episodes, as you know. So one of the reasons we did that was to make it something that is entertaining, obviously, and through humor that can be very powerful for making people able to talk about complicated issues and to recognize them without feeling lectured or threatened. And then also that it can be easily consumed, so that you can sort of have a taste, you dip your toe into this thing, and then you can go off and think about it. And that it can be used by teachers as a teaching tool. Right. So that all came together. We said, you know what, this is the moment that we should be putting this out, so that people can be, it can hopefully help sustain a conversation about this. And then in the 6 weeks of each episode coming out, it just has exploded as part of the narrative as well, nationally, of people recognizing it. So it is kind of sustaining and encouraging that conversation, which is really wonderful to see.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, obviously this comes from your parents' experience, but what is the moment that happened that made you decide, let's turn it into a project?
Oh, well, our mom, I think it was, said, this would be a great comedy, because all these parts that our father was getting offered, some of them he would turn down because they were just offensive, but somebody was taking that part. And so but a lot of them were just named old guy, and she said, wouldn't that be hilarious as a way to bring up these issues of on-screen marginalization and stereotyping of people. And so it was a conversation, and there were, some drafts that went through, and then of thinking out what are each of these major stereotypes that would be interesting to discuss, and that can be funny without being offensive, without using humor that's offensive. And also bring up really complicated issues. Like, it's fine for people, you need to have people advertising products about incontinence and, ED medicine, etc. But if that's the only thing you see old people doing, that's the problem. And so in the script process, we thought, well, Harry, who's played by our dad, can be the every person stand-in, who is someone who recognizes the humor and all this stuff, and yet says, wait a second, but this is all it's getting. And then visually contrasting that to his rich personal life on screen, which is not commented on at all, but you get that by watching it. And then having his wife, who's played by our mother, be the counterpoint, is sort of questioning, really, is this good? And then he walks through that journey of recognizing it and then starting to want to change it. And his hilarious agent, played by Perry Gilpin, she's an interesting point of conversation, because these systemic, stereotyped systems or systems of injustice have complexity. So it's not her fault that he's doing them, but she's one cog in the wheel, because she's trying to make her 10% as his agent and wants him to go out and keep working. And so is she to blame? No, but she is part of that system as well.
And your mom was a writer on the show, correct?
Yeah.
Which is just so cool.
There's actually a behind the scenes that we just put out that's just 2 minutes, sort of behind the scenes thing, and it was so fun to just kind of relive the shooting of this, because one of the things that we can really do to combat ageism is encouraging intergenerational relationships. Mm-hmm. So the whole the whole gamut from, you know, just saying hi to people on this, you know, when you're walking down the street, to reaching out to neighbors, to actually engaging in deep, meaningful ways with people. Or I know, like, there are many high schools now that are doing kind of Zooms or letters or things for people that are in homes, or people that are in their own home and isolated, to really think about how can we build these intergenerational relationships. And that was one thing with making this film, is that they were just, you know, the whole range from literally an infant. My niece was an infant, you know, up through people older than my dad, you know, in their 90s in it. And all of my students were there. They all were able to come to LA, and it's from Tufts University. So we shot at Tufts, and then we shot around Boston, and then we shot in Los Angeles. And, you know, I just think that kind of as an experience, it really, the process of it was also doing this work. You know, it was also breaking down these sort of barriers that we have as a society between people of different ages.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me just thinking about that is like that one like outtake after the credits when your dad's like going on the swearing rant, you know?
Yeah.
And it's so funny and so, like, you know, organic, but you know, thinking about young people being able to see that, being like, oh, I might say that too. You know what I mean? Like, there's some sort of like real connective moment in there.
It used to drive my mom crazy when people would say, I can't believe you swear, you know, and she's like, we invented the free speech movement. You know, this is ridiculous, right? But people sort of think, oh, you're in your 70s or 80s, you know, you're not going to swear. And it's like, of course you are.
Of course you are. I love it. Gabrielle, you sort of started talking about like the series and the timing of it. And what else just strikes me is that the format is so perfect. Like these short episodes, it just especially right now with the way people are consuming media, and because everything is virtual, and you know, there's virtual cinema and Netflix and Hulu, and you know, there's just so much out there. But like creating something like this in this sort of format where you can binge the whole thing in 25 minutes is just so brilliant. And I think oftentimes a lot more effective in terms of messaging than maybe a feature film. But that said, when did you, I mean, and the fact that you shot this, or, you know, in 2013, that was 4 years ago. I mean, that was, I think episodic is much further along than it was then. What were the sort of, when did you decide that's what the format was going to be, and that was going to be the most effective way to tell the story?
Yeah, that was actually always the format. And I think that, as you said, it's so striking that sort of the whole world has come to that. And it actually was a little bit of an issue in the beginning, because we were saying, how do we distribute this in the beginning, right? Because we were feature filmmakers and we make, you know, but because we kept honing it down, because, well, one reason is really teaching, that when you're teaching, having little short things that are humorous are great for people in college, right? Because they can just watch them. And this was true, you know, 6 years ago, and when we were, or 7 years ago when we were shooting it. So that was, I think, driving it. But now what's so great is that everyone's used to this kind of content, right? It was very odd at the time. So it is really nice. One thing that I also am struck by is that I wanted to say a little bit more about making it with the students, because I think that having these conversations that we need to have, like this is so wonderful, to have a conversation with people who are involved in the arts, and you know, having it with people in college and having it with the older people, because many of my students went on to be in the business. And they said that now they recognize it, right? So sort of like this little short content can give you just the window into it. And then suddenly you're like, oh, when you see it the next time, right? And so I think that's, like you said, you know, it can be enough just to kind of make people aware. But it's not hard to watch. It's funny. So
yeah, and comedy's accessible. So that's what's brilliant about this being funny, but comedy is also very hard. And you know, I think short comedy especially, yeah, exactly. So what was it like for you guys making this series versus like making a feature film and telling a story like this rather than like a 90-minute story with an arc like that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think in some ways the process is very similar. I think comedy is incredibly difficult, and we've done a lot of comedies, and we love that challenge, and also figuring out how do you make people laugh with a certain kind of economy, and a respect for the viewer to get something or to bring to it their own experience. And so in this, I know that typically what we do is we'll make the project the way that we're wanting to make it, edit it. And when things aren't working, and again, you have 5 siblings, so we're each coming to it saying, oh, I don't like that, or that's not, and we'll have those kind of arguments that you would have either in production or between siblings. But we'll say, I hate that line, or that's the best line. And we figure it out because we all deeply respect each other. So we'll get to a point where we say, okay, this is the product we think it is. And then we do test screenings and we see how other people respond. And generally we choose a diverse range of people to watch it. So we understand sort of some of their background or where they're coming from or what they're interested in. And then take that feedback and then figure out what's working and what isn't working. And at a certain point in each of our films, you get to a point where the discussion becomes about the subject itself or the story, rather than about the craft of the filmmaking. And so generally when the discussion becomes really all over the place and people aren't sharing the same commentary, we know that we're done. And so that's what happened with this. And then we basically finished the whole series, a couple months ago, Jen, right? It was at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah, right at the very beginning of COVID.
And then we decided, okay, we're gonna release it for free, widely, because that's the best way to get accessibility and to get engagement. And so we did a whole campaign with, IGTV and YouTube and Facebook, and that's what our time's been going into now, so.
Yeah.
So how did you guys split up the roles? Did you all take turns directing, or was it kind of for this project specific roles for each person?
That's a funny thing because we all are directors. So that can be, with a feature, actually that can be tricky because, if we all come on board for a feature, that's a lot of time that's going into a project, right? But with the short content, that's a wonderful thing about it. So we actually all directed, we co-directed each of the series. So we each were co-directed
Each of the episodes.
I'm sorry?
Each of the episodes.
Each of the episodes, yeah. Yeah, so we each directed 2. And we also all were writing on it. So since we're all producers, I always find this with sibling teams, you can have different credits, but very often you're all playing a very strong creative role, yeah. I think, on many of these sibling teams. And yet the industry sort of requires that you divide it out by name. But I found on like other of our projects, we also have, you have, as a producer, you have some parts that are part directing too, right? Or are part writing too, or part editing too. And so what's wonderful about the short content is that we can actually sort of have each of us take on those roles for different episodes or different short films.
Right.
We have a lot where people get nervous when you have 5 people in charge, that it's going to take forever or that we're going to not agree. And actually what's interesting, and it goes back to what you were saying, Eric, about siblings, is that we speak in a shorthand. We've known each other all our lives. And so you don't really have to deal with all that stuff of like, what does she mean by saying that? Or what was that thing about? We can very quickly, just even with a look, know where we're coming from or what could make it better. Or and then on set, people would have often commented that they like how, who's ever directing is obviously the person in charge and has the final say. And yet we're all there as the support team to help make the best product. And so we trust each other on that front. So even switching off roles, it can be a fluid conversation, but very quick too, which is nice.
Right, especially with that shorthand of like nonverbal communications that
exactly.
Just each other.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's dig into the subject of ageism a bit. And for that matter, the power of on-screen representation. So big question, Why is ageism an issue that needs attention? And why does it get left out of the conversation so often? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, the first part of that, I think, is just lack of representation. So 10% of characters on television are over 65, a little less than 10%, versus nearly 20% in the population. So you're having half the number of characters on television that there are in real life, right? And then of those characters, they are very often these small parts that are stereotyped, right? So you're getting this, each one has more of an impact because there aren't a lot of them, right? And when people see these narrow ideas of what it means to be old, they take that becomes internalized. So that's one of the problems, is that through education, people who actually do media literacy courses as an older person, they can actually temper that. And they found that people, it stops having as much of an impact, partly because people stop watching as much television, which is sort of interesting, because they don't see themselves as much in it. And they're like, But the other thing that happens is for younger people, it affects medicine. You know, we found this very much with our parents, that people would, wonderful people who are caring doctors and nurses would talk to younger people in the room instead of the person who was the patient. And it's just part of what we've kind of...
Or they'd distrust things. Like our dad was in the ICU. After our mom died, he started getting ill, and a doctor, he was saying, this is not the right medicine you're giving me. And all the people kept saying, oh, yes, honey, you know, yes, it is. Yes, it is. And he kept saying, no, it's not. And then finally, when he was sort of lucid enough to say, you're giving me the wrong medicine, and you're putting, like, this other medicine, it was an eye medicine, you're putting it in the wrong eye.
He was absolutely right.
And he was right, you know, at a 90-year-old man who was saying, I've been telling you this for a couple of weeks. And no one would believe him. And it was really difficult. And we were all there, and we were thinking, well, we're trusting the health professionals because they have his chart. But it just came down to a kind of ageism of like, oh, yes, dear. You know, I know better. And that actually is life impacting. Luckily, right. In his case, it wasn't, but it was very medically difficult for him.
Yeah, and you find this in employment, and you find it in, I mean, all sorts of ranges of what do people think is the potential for people, right? Mm-hmm. And so the first step, I think, is having people. I found this very much with the shift onto even Zoom, that people will say, oh, I'm too old to learn that technology. And it's like, but they watch Netflix all the time. They do all sorts of things. They have a smartphone, right? No, it is not too hard to learn Zoom. It's a link, right? But because of this kind of internalized idea that learning new things or computer things are hard when you're older or whatever, you know, people will be cut out of these really critical conversations, and it increases isolation, rather than sort of saying, gosh, I don't really understand this. And is it possible to learn? Is it very complicated, right? But sort of having a kind of attitude that's not accepting these limitations based on age, right? That are, that in that case, are totally not true.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Well, it's also funny because, like, you know, how many 20 to 40-year-olds don't understand how to use Zoom? It's like you can't turn off your mute button when you're doing something, you know, and there are all those fails that have been on. So it has nothing to do with age. It has to do with, you know, technological prowess. And so that's a whole thing that then people buy into, and then you have generational buy-in as well, intergenerational buy-in, and then it's a feeding loop, a feedback loop. And interestingly, during the production of Tufts, because Old Guy, because Jennifer at Tufts designed the production to include all of these students, they were able to learn from multiple ages. So they were able to come on set and have sort of mentorships in their departments with people who were in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. And then they're working with actors who are older. And they were able to see all these people being vibrant at different ages, having different kinds of experience. And everybody was richer for it. And then they've gone on to, even as Jennifer had referred to, they've gone on to comment about that. And yet in their own work, they're actually bringing that to their work as well. So in television and in film production, they're asking the questions of, well, what representation are we putting on screen? Does it, are we representing race and age and gender in a way that is commensurate with society? And when we're representing it, how are we representing it? Are we allowing a full range of diversity there? And so that's really amazing, because in this tiny project, only 25 minutes, it's been having these domino effects on different levels that go on. And so hopefully people watching it as well can go on and have those conversations and then have their, pebbles thrown into the pond that echo on.
That's so important. And it really does start with educating young people at the very, youngest level of, and for all sorts of these, issues, that societal issues and injustices. I think the more that we can, educate the young people, as generations will change. But you'd made a really good comment about accessibility. And in my day job, working with all these film festivals that have now gone online, one of the big conversations is accessibility. And I love that you put it on YouTube and you made it free. I think that is so hugely important. So thank you for doing that, because I think that's the way to reach the audiences.
Thanks. We also closed captioned it.
Closed captioned it, yeah.
To make it also accessible for all ages and all hearing abilities.
Very important. Thank you for doing that too.
So, okay, you started talking about kind of intergenerational relationships. How is ageism harmful, not just to older people, but also to the younger people? Like there's do you guys know the okay boomer?
Oh yeah,
absolutely. So we have this conversation a lot, my kids and I.
So yeah, like it's meant to be funny, but how is it, if it is harmful, and kind of how does ageism impact young people?
Yeah, Gabrielle and I are actually giving a talk at a conference called Not Okay Boomer coming up.
That's awesome.
So, I think that there definitely are some people who are entrenched in their thinking or benefited from the status quo, right? So I get that. And I think that that's what's being critiqued with the okay boomer. It's sort of, with climate change or with, any kind of difficulty that people are not acknowledging that we have to change as a society, right? I get that. But if you make it about age, you miss, say, Al Gore, for example, right? Or all of the many people, Bill McKibben, or incredible activists who have been instrumental in creating the green movement, right? So if you're sort of cutting off experience and incredible engagement and the possibility of having allies of all different ages, you're missing out on all of this possibility, right? To learn and to act, to be active together, right? So I think that that's the problem with those kinds of things, is that they make something about age rather than about what is the particular thing you're critiquing. Are you critiquing, you could say, ostrich with their head in the sand, or you could say like something else that's not saying your age makes you a certain way. Because there's so many people that are not that way, right?
Yeah, and I think this also ties into this kind of modern phenomenon of, through humor, having a kind of contempt that is simplifying complexity that exists. And so that is very seductive. It's very seductive to want to sort of wipe someone away by saying something that's reductive and dismissive. And we have that all flying around us all the time, this idea of sort of divisive contempt and dismissiveness between people that lead to more division and more misunderstanding. And so the problem with a comment like that is, within 2 words, you're basically contemptuously dismissing somebody and everything they might have to bring to the conversation. So as Jennifer says, it's really about what are their actions? What is their discussion and the problems that you have with that? And so in choosing other verbiage that can acknowledge the complexity and also their ability to change or to redefine what they're thinking.
Yeah, because you can't change your name, right? I mean, your age. If you are a boomer, you're a boomer, right? And what do you want? You want people to be able to open up to new possibility and to become part of the solution, right? You don't want to just have them dismissed. So I think that, again, that also is a problem with labeling that they're just like a lost cause. You know, that's,
Yeah. Well, and that one of the things I've been thinking about that this brought up is trying to think of examples of, you know, Hollywood movies or Hollywood, you know, shows that have been made that kind of got kind of anti-ageist. And the only one I can really think of, and maybe this is just because I'm a gay man, is Golden Girls. Is like,
Golden
it's,
Girls was absolutely fabulous.
yeah,
I mean,
it tackled all that stuff.
absolutely.
And
I mean, Gracie and Frankie, I think, is doing that
oh,
now.
yes, Grace and Frankie is the new one. Okay, so what I was just going to ask you, like, what other examples can you think of?
And there's
like,
the Kaminsky method, which is sort of, you know,
Yeah.
following the example of Grace and Frankie's success. And I think on a lot of these things, as we've also seen with films that, you know, show Hispanic people or Black people or women in lead roles, you end up having this huge success often of these diverse representations because A, it's interesting to see something you haven't seen all the time, and B, there's a huge market out there who wants to see themselves on screen or wants to see, you know, cross-generational or more diversity represented on screen, and more complexity in the stories. And so that, I think, is something that now is happening again. It's like Golden Girls had this heyday. People have loved that for years. They're huge, you know, diehard fans, and obviously, and yet, why did all of that kind of, you know, representation of older women just disappear when the incredible success of that show? Why not do 20 more? And
Right.
that's the question to be asking.
Yeah, one thing that happened when you have just so little representation is that it seems like it's an anomaly. It seemed like it's because B. Arthur's amazing, right? For example, or something like that, right? And so or Cocoon, say the film was incredibly popular, right? But it was like, how strange, you know? And used to have this with, you know, sort of a Chris Rock film or with other things. It was like they were the exceptions, you know? And then you get enough.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, these aren't exceptions. You know,
Right.
You have to get enough made out there that suddenly becomes clear that people actually want to see this content. But you know, it's weird. The Gina Davis Institute does studies on this, and they've shown that it's more profitable to have diverse representation. It's more profitable, and it's a business. It's a movie business, you know, so it just doesn't make any sense from an economic standpoint.
And we've seen some development and progress in this, and like LGBTQ characters used to always be used as butts of jokes, and it's very difficult. I'm a parent, and we watch some of these older movies, and it's just horrifying the way that you have characters represented, and it's not even discussed. It's just that it's, you know, implied, and that has completely changed, you know, within our lifetimes, and that's wonderful. That now there are, you know, people who are gay and it's not part of the story. I mean, that was one of the things in one of our films where one of our earliest films, Temps, where I wrote that script and I wanted to have a gay character who didn't actually have a coming out story. It was like, he was just gay. That was just like the point. His parents, he had tension with them over it, but the story wasn't, his storyline wasn't at all about that. And it was so interesting because people watching it would say, gosh, you know, I think that guy's gay. You know, maybe you need to have him come out on screen. And it was like, why do we, you know, and now what's so heartwarming is you have so many characters on screen, and it's just the way it is. We're watching Supergirl in our family right now. And I just love how within the context of an action film of a little trouble with the violence, but, you know, and conflict resolution through violence, but they are just having all these people who are LGBTQ, who are trans, who are, you know, mixed race, who are all different kinds of belief systems, and they don't mention anything about it. It's just part of the background, basically, to the storyline.
For the world, yeah. And you know, if we can have our world be as colorful as our world is, it makes such better art. It makes such, you know, it's everything about it. So
It
I
reflects it reflects the way the world truly is. And, I think back, you're just talking about television from, the 80s. And I think back to all those sitcoms that were just so full of white privilege and, just like how entertained I was by them. And it's like horrifying. There was the token gay character, the token like black friend, or whatever. But speaking of television, I do feel like, that's the beauty of this explosion of this other format, is that there's so much more opportunity for shows like you said, the Kaminsky Method and Great Frankie, and for these actors who are these wonderful actors who wouldn't be getting these film roles, but now have this opportunity to continue showcasing their, talent in front of the screen in these amazing, better than Hollywood stories. One quote that I will always remember from First Wives Club, when Goldie Hawn said, "There are 3 ages for women in Hollywood: babe, district attorney, and driving Miss Daisy." And I don't feel like that's necessarily gotten better in film, but I do think for television, there are a lot more opportunities. I do think, and just to Bill's question there, it seems to me like, at least in European cinema, and there's all of the dames who are so wonderful and who continue to have these vibrant acting careers. And maybe in cinema I'm not as familiar with cinema from other parts of the world, Eric, maybe you are, but that there is more representation than there is here in the States. Do you find that to be true, and have studies shown that?
Yeah, so the studies, like the Gina Davis and everything, are pretty much based on US distribution, but this is an area actually that I'm interested in studying, in terms of looking at cultures where they have more multi-generational families. I want to see, how are older people represented in cinema and on television, because I think that I would predict that it would be much less easy to classify people as other if you're around them all the time, right? Because you know people. And so that would be my prediction, but I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I'm thinking of even like movies like Parasite and Roma, and films that are like, from other countries that have these characters and these like very intergenerational casts that you don't see as much in like Hollywood films, which is, again, the beauty of independent cinema.
Well, and that's something that you see a lot, like what you were saying, Parasite. There's so many Korean dramas where, like, I'm talking like the television shows even, where the matriarch of the family is like a very important character. And so I do think a lot of it has to do with kind of this American idealization of youth
Culture. Yeah. Definitely.
Right, like the farewell. Yeah.
We talked about in this that it'd be really great to have, you have all these like 20 under 20, 30 under 30, and tons of focus on the potential that people will have in their lifetime. And we would love to see 70 over 70 or, 60 over 60. But basically the long game for people is really impressive. And sometimes if you're a concert pianist who can still play at 75, something beautifully, like that is an incredible achievement, so we don't somehow value that as much in our culture. And it would be nice to see some more of that.
There's things like in Japan, there's this idea of the living treasures, where people have this cultural wealth and knowledge that they're holding because of experience, right? And I feel like we have to recognize, we recognize that a little bit. I was actually looking at this story today about how devastating it is in Europe to be losing so many people who were telling the story, personal stories about the Holocaust. So they were able to be teaching that just to children. But because of COVID, there's so many people that are actually dying, and they're the receptacles of our history in a very immediate way. And so I think that that's been recognized to some extent by filmmakers and by people in terms of certain stories, but just really seeing like what all of life experience, it brings you to a different place. We all know that, like every decade that you're on this planet, you change and you grow, hopefully. So having that kind of ability to have people reach their full potential and continue to grow and learn and change and have adventures at any age. And then also having all of us benefit from that experience and that knowledge, that would be the wish, right?
Yeah, and so, some of that depends on who the storytellers are too. So I think that hopefully all of these sort of supportive filmmaking organizations like the AFI Fest, or these places that do things to help storytellers who otherwise would maybe not get a voice, that is what is so important going forward in the future too, because I think a lot of that richness comes out of it. We sisters have a lot of women, sorry, there's a fly that likes me now. A lot of women have gone into independent filmmaking because that's the path where you have the ability to actually be an artist and you have to carve your own paths. And it's frustrating, but that's also something that in literally the last few years has become something very acknowledged and is being addressed, hopefully. And so, systemically within the film business. And so that will only create more richness. So it is a really interesting thing to see the rise of digital distribution as well. And we were lucky on this project that we didn't have the financial pressure to make back the funds that were put into it. And so we could release it for free, but that's not a sustainable model, and we as women need to earn a salary. So there has to be some system put into place to support that kind of voice and that kind of story to be told.
Yes, and we as women need to value our worth and the work that we do, and monetarily, not just socially, not just the I guess, yes, we need to be paid equally. But
there was an interesting thing you brought up about one thing that they've found when you look at different shows on television that have more ageism or less ageism, and the ones with a writer in the room who is over 40, which in Hollywood is older, have much less ageism. So it's like a direct correlation that when you get older people in the room who have creative decisions, these jokes disappear, right? And you get more interesting, more complex characters. And I think that recognizing that all across the board, that's the diversity we need in the writers' rooms, in the showrunners, and ageism is sort of the last acceptable. People make jokes about their own age all the time. Oh, I'm just going senile, or whatever. Like all these kinds of things that people will do all the time, and even on shows when you have all of these ageist jokes, it's considered okay because it just hasn't kind of been brought to our attention that these have actual real harm. So I think that the more that we can recognize it, and then also bring in different kinds of voices, including older artists on these shows, will make a tremendous difference.
And part of that then has to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Part of that has to do with what you both were saying about youth culture, that the more that we focus on, oh, I'm getting old, oh, look at my wrinkles, that we think that's a bad thing, rather than signs of wisdom and gaining experience and gaining knowledge and gaining a sort of matrix to then make better decisions in the future. And once you have all these layers of experience, we can help, society more, and we can learn from past mistakes and do things better in the future. Rather than just sort of swinging and to break down a system. And I think that one of the most interesting things with this issue now is that the baby boom has gotten older. And so that's why when you're having Grace and Frankie and you're having the Kominsky Method and these other shows that now are coming out, it's like, well, because these people are older and we love these people still, and they're all still really active. And so they don't want to give up working because somebody's saying they can't. And that's really wonderful as part of the sort of boomer movement.
Yeah. Well, and I think, go Leila.
Oh, no, you go, Eric.
I was just going to say the behind the camera stories are also important. Like, I think it's really amazing to hear that your parents came into the industry later in life. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, very inspirational as well.
Yeah, it's tricky. Our mother, she had definite challenges of ageism that, even in applying and onward. And it took breaking down that and just sort of keeping on. And actually she felt a lot of pressure to dye her hair because she was someone who didn't dye her hair. And then she was in film school, and I think it was a few months in, right, Jen? And she dyed her hair, and then for some reason it was like a holiday weekend, she had to do it, and my sister and dad said they would do it, and they did it, and it was not good. It was totally like a black, mop on her head. And she went to school, and what was really interesting was all the 20-year-olds were saying like, awesome, like you're a punk. And that was so funny too, because you talk about like ageist interpretation. It was, she's having this feeling of like, I have to cover this up, and they're all thinking, wow, she's so edgy, I want to be like her when I grow up.
Like Agnes Varda, right? So you do a very extreme thing, and then which I think is a great way to go. Don't try to look natural, maybe.
I love that. And speaking of like these, our obsession with youth culture, and like how we can all work to like sort of eradicate the idea that like, if you have a baby when you're 30, you're advanced maternal age, and these crazy things, these crazy labels that get put on us. One thing that I'm really happy to see in a lot of the work that I'm doing is when applying for grants and running programs through, through the Film Festival Alliance, is that when we're looking at inclusion, often ageism is now included in, gender and ethnicity and sexual orientation. And are you over 50 is often a question. And that's something we do.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I've been seeing that a lot more. And I know Gina, I worked at the Bentonville Film Festival for a little while, and I know that was part of that mission too. So I do think
2017, they came out with a huge study on it, but that was the first time, right? Yeah. That really looking specifically at age and who's writing and who's making. Right.
And I think people also don't realize that Gina Davis is 64 years old. That's pretty amazing, right?
It's amazing.
So
I think, back to my mom, like she actually won the nickel, but her script was about an older woman. And
so you should explain. It's like it's like given by the Academy. It's sort of an Oscar for an unproduced screenplay. It's to try to get them to be made.
Yeah, and so it's this big deal, but very often those are made, except for this was about an older female character. And just, in terms of money, it was set in the Russian Revolution, and this is changing, but I think that's the other thing that has to happen, is sort of recognizing that we need to actually make higher production value for stories about diverse characters, because a lot of times you end up making just your darndest, the best thing you can make, but your camera's not the fabulous camera. You don't have a crane. You don't have, you're like working with these incredible constraints. Everybody is, eating potato chips instead of whatever it is, right? And I think that recognizing that there is there's kind of resources. There's only so much you can do with nothing.
Yeah, and how much money is being put into these other voices. So we also have that with the film we've been trying to get made of the Mercury 13, who were 13 women who were tested to be astronauts in 1961 and 62, alongside the men. And there were a lot of scientists behind saying women should go because we could beat the space race. We could win it with women because they weigh less, they ate less, they use less oxygen. And so there were a lot of scientific reasons why women were considered by scientists to be people who should go as the astronauts, but there were social reasons and sexist reasons of why people didn't want them, and very complicated reasons. And one of the characters we'd had in one of the versions of the script, she's gay, and we made that part of the storyline. And one of the reactions we got from one of the studio people was, well, so first of all, you cut out half your audience because it's about women. And secondly, then you've cut out basically like 90% of those because she's gay. And it was just, you're thinking, wait, this is an amazing action film. Like, it's an incredible, big history, exciting movie. And why isn't every audience interested? Like, how are you saying cutting off half of the audience because of biology? I mean, all of the logic was off. So hopefully now that we are seeing this kind of narrative where people are recognizing these problems. I mean, I feel like in the past few years, the past almost 4 years have been, I think, very painful for our country. And yet what it has brought out is people actually discussing things and not letting them go, not letting them sort of be swept under the rug. And so hopefully together, as we realize that our voices are amplified by these media, by these mediums like YouTube, like we're able to have conversations and not silence ourselves, like Jennifer is also referring to, that a lot of people will stop talking or be part of the conversation because they feel like, oh, I'm not relevant anymore, or I don't have a voice, or I can't be empowered. We can be. And so that is something that's very hopeful, I think, in these kind of entertainment forums.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, due to the pandemic, and maybe one of the silver linings that comes out of it is the way Hollywood makes and distributes movies. That's definitely a big issue. And so maybe there's more opportunity for this kind of inclusive programming, and for it to be seen on a wider level. We've gone over our hour, which is always like, we're always like, oh, we'll just talk for half an hour. And then it ends up being, you know, we could talk to you all day. And we'll definitely have to have you come back on. Maybe we can do a conversation about the documentary.
Great.
Yeah, that would be great. It's always wonderful to meet filmmakers who are doing thoughtful work, and you know, who are making stories for a reason, and telling stories that will hopefully change the world. So thank you, Jen and Gabrielle, so much for joining us. This was really wonderful. And to everyone who's watching this on YouTube, please just find YouTube. Find Old Guy on YouTube. We will make a link to click on it so you can binge it in 25 minutes. It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this story with the world, and, you know, your family with the world, and your parents, and for joining us today to talk about this. Ageism is obviously something that needs to be addressed more, and I feel more educated just having had this conversation and having seen Old Guy. So we really can't thank you enough. My dog's going crazy. Somebody might be at the front door. So on that note, we'll talk to you again soon. We'll be in touch and have you back on soon.
Excellent. Lovely to talk to you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.